In this bootcamp tutorial, we're going to look at what exposure is, how to expose your image, and something called the exposure triangle. So first of all, what the hell is exposure? I'm sure you're familiar with the word, but maybe you don't know exactly what it is. Now, exposure is basically just a fancy word for how much light that is hitting your camera sensor. Well, that's not really helpful, so an even easier way to look at it is how bright or dark your image is. So when your image is too bright, like this one, it's called overexposed, like you overdid it this time. And when your image is too dark, it's called underexposed, like you underdid it. Now maybe you clicked on this video because you wanted to learn more than just a fancy word. Well, I got you. So to learn how to properly expose our image, that being photo or video, we need to understand 3 settings to adjust our exposure. And the first one is shutter speed. And this is the most important one. And if you ask me, the easiest way to understand shutter speed is to look at it through a photo perspective. When you take a photo, it can either look like this, or it can look like this. And you know that lovely sound a camera makes whenever you take a photo? That's your camera's shutter opening and closing. Your camera shutter is basically a mechanical door in front of your camera sensor that decides how much light the camera should let in. So as long as the shutter is open, it registers everything that is happening in your scene. So if whatever you're photographing is moving faster than the time it takes for the shutter to open and close, that subject or animal or person will get blurry. Just like this picture of water that I shot. I shot it at 1/4 of a second, meaning that the camera shutter is open for just 1/4 of a second. And that may seem fast, but it's not. Because in this 1/4 of a second, the water had time to move from here to there, making it blurry. And this blur is known as motion blur. Blur caused by motion, and that's another fancy word for you. But if we were to move that shutter speed up to something like 1/500th of a second, that's super fast, right? And we take another picture of the water, instead of now being blurry, the water will be crispy and look like it's frozen in time. And that is because now the water didn't have time to move because the shutter opened and closed faster than the water could move, making it appear frozen in time. But now, of course, we have a new problem. Our photo is way too dark. Like, here's the original image before I brightened it up to this, and you can see that it's a lot darker than the 1/4 of a second photo. And that is because not only does the shutter speed decide our motion blur, but it also decides our exposure, or how dark or bright our image is. This is because now the shutter was only open for 1/500th of a second, which is super fast. So this means that not enough light could hit the sensor before the shutter closed again. To make this super clear, I'll use water again. So this is our camera sensor. The water is light and me pouring represents the shutter speed, how long the shutter is open. So if we have a slower shutter speed at 1/4 of a second, the shutter is open for longer, letting lots of wonderful light into our camera sensor. But if we instead have a faster shutter speed at, let's say, 1/500th of a second, that's not a lot of light to work with, and that's why the photo gets darker. Now the remaining question might be, what does this have to do with video? I mean, it's video, so you're not gonna freeze anything, right? And while that is true, the reason why shutter speed in video is so important is because we want a natural looking motion blur. Confused yet? I'll explain. If you were to do this with your hand, not only would you look stupid, but you can also see that your hand gets blurry. And this is because our eyes and our brain capture motion blur naturally. And this is what we want to recreate in our videos to make them look, well, as natural as possible. So to get this natural looking motion blur, we need a specific shutter speed. And to know what shutter speed to use, we need to look at one of the many rules in cinema, the 180-degree shutter rule. What? In order to get the most natural looking motion blur, you need to set your shutter speed double to whatever your frame rate is. What? Now, if you don't know what frame rate is, we're gonna look at that in a specific episode, but just trust me for now. Normal speed video is between 24 and 30 frames per second, meaning that we have 24 or 30 individual frames in every second of video. So if we shoot at 24 frames per second and we need to double our shutter speed to our frame rate, we need to have a shutter speed of 1/48 of a second. And now most hybrid cameras can't be that specific with the shutter speed, so we'll just have to use the closest one. In my case, 1/50th of a second. So if we were to shoot at 60 frames per second for slow motion video, we would use a shutter speed of 120. Does it make sense? It should. Or I suck at this. Now you may wonder, but when I shoot video, I can't hear the shutter open and close. And that's true because the shutter can't open and close that fast. Instead, when we shoot video, the camera is reading the sensor from top to bottom and your shutter speed decides how fast it should read. So even though we don't have a mechanical shutter when we shoot video, the shutter speed works the same way for both photo and video. But in video, it's more important that we keep that specific shutter speed to get that most natural looking motion blur, which means that we have to change something else to balance our exposure. So the next setting that we have to change our exposure is called aperture, and this is the most important one. So the aperture isn't actually connected to the camera itself. It's that little iris inside your lens that is opening and closing like this to let different amounts of light in. So just like all the exposure settings, this adjusts two things. Not only your exposure, but your depth of field. Now I understand that this whole camera dictionary will be very tough at first, but I promise you will get the hang of it. I believe in you. So the depth of field refers to the area in your image that is in focus. And listen now, because the lower number you have, the more light the lens will let in. And if you ask me, it would make sense that a large number would let more light in, but no. Now in my videos, I have a very shallow depth of field. My computer is out of focus, my background is out of focus, my hand gets out of focus if I do this. My depth of field lies around my face and body here. This is because I have a low f number of 1.4. This means that the lens is letting in a lot of light to the camera, but it also gives me this blurry background. We can actually close the aperture down to 10 and I'm gonna show you the difference. So here we are at f10. I bet you can barely see me now, but you can see my little light tube over here. So we're gonna turn that back up. Now you can see what a huge difference that does to our exposure, but we're also going to look at something else that we couldn't see now. So now we're also at f10, but instead we brighten the exposure in the room using our lights. And as you can see now, a lot more of the room is in focus. The computer is looking sharper, the background is looking sharper, and I'm still sharp. And this is because when we lower our aperture, we get a deeper depth of field, or more of our shot is in focus. So if we want this amount of motion blur, the shutter speed is locked, and we also want this shallow depth of field, so our aperture is also locked. But let's say our image is still too dark. That is when we introduce our third and last setting, which is called ISO. And this is the most important one. It's also, as you may have already guessed, a bit confusing. The ISO number determines how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Basically, the higher number you have, the more sensitive your sensor becomes to light, which sort of brightens the image digitally. And I mean, doesn't this sound amazing to just be able to brighten the image whenever it's too dark? Well, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is, and unfortunately, this is not an exception. Here's a fast story time. Before digital cameras came to be the standard, we used to shoot on film rolls, and these film rolls had different ISO values like 200, 400, 800, and so on. And the film rolls with a higher ISO value had worse quality and noisier images. And I'm telling you this because even though it's fully digital now, unfortunately it still works the same way. When you push your camera's ISO too much, the image will get noisy and the quality will get worse. Which in a way sort of makes sense because you're sort of adding fake light that doesn't exist, sort of. Let's have a look at two examples. The right one is shot at the camera's native ISO of 640. Native ISO is basically where the camera works the best. And the left one is shot at 10,000 ISO, which is way higher than 640. And if we were to zoom in, we can see that not only the quality is worse, but you can also see a lot of noise has been added to the image. And this is not something that we want. And this is why it's so important to know your camera's ISO limit. How far can you push your camera's ISO before the image gets unusable? Also, some cameras like my Sony a7S III have dual ISO, and this is basically that the camera has two native ISO or two ISO limits, and this is actually pretty incredible. I have no idea how it works, but I'm gonna just show you an example. If we instead now put the 10,000 example to the right, and then we put a 12,800 example to the left, you can see that the 12,800 example is a lot cleaner than the 10,000. And that is because as soon as you nudge the ISO setting one more time from 10,000 to 12,800, the image just becomes super clean. And again, I have no idea how this works, but I love it. So these are the three settings to change your exposure, and as you can see, all the settings have different effects on your image. This is why it's so important to bring your camera out and try your ISO limit, see how blurry the image gets if you shoot at different shutter speeds, or how to get this nice blurry background if you change your aperture. As you get better, this will all be locked in your muscle memory, but the best thing you can do now is to just bring the camera outside, point to different things, and try to expose to it using all these settings. And remember that if you shoot video, you need to have double your shutter speed to your frame rate. Remember? Now again, I understand that this is super confusing, and I bet you're gonna have to revisit this episode or watch someone else explain it to you, but I promise you'll get the hang of it, because I did. But I believe I've covered more than the basics, and if you're still confused or have any questions, just leave them in the comments or ask away in the Facebook group, and I will see you in the next one.